Greetings and welcome to In-Depth. I'm Dike Rostant. We discuss implications of the change in local government elections from 3 to 4 years, as well as the significance of politicians and the populace knowing what we should expect from those in political office, and we do so with political analyst Dr. Bishnu Ragoonath. Welcome, Dr. Ragoonath. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And it is really a pleasure to be speaking with you to get this kind of layman's breakdown of local government, because I think sometimes there are things that are said and the way that they're said, they may fly over the heads of some. But I want to ask, though, start off by asking about the extension of local government elections from 3 to 4 years, and what kinds of impact on governance do you think that we can have?
Okay, so the decision to extend the term from 3 years to 4 years, and we're not here talking about the specific instance of this extension, but rather generally. 3 years to 4 years would mean that simply that the council that would be put in office would now have the opportunity of having a longer period to ensure they could deliver on the various promises as well as services that the citizenry require. Bear in mind that in local government, it is the local environment, the local community that is the interest of the local authority as well as the people. They are concerned about what can be done to improve the quality of lives for themselves, and the local government authority is supposed to facilitate that process by making sure that certain services are provided. So, for instance, are we going to get our garbage collected on time? Are the roads going to be repaired and not develop into potholes and trenches and so forth? Are the drains going to be cleaned so much so that there's no stagnation of water and the breeding of insects? Are we going to have the markets and so on running efficiently and effectively? So these are the concerns that people have. There's also the concern, for instance, about play fields and parks and so on. Are they going to be maintained so that people could use them to improve on their own quality of life, whether it be for exercise, for recreation purposes, whatever? And those are the things that local government are supposed to do. And it is in the context of doing those things, we say all of those things lead on to the development of the human person to live a more wholesome, higher quality of life than they would have lived previously. And that is where local government becomes important. Now, 3 years to 4 years means simply that the council has a longer time to make sure that they deliver. And in many instances, the plans and programs that they may have, depending on their budgetary allocations and so forth, may not allow them to do everything that they need to do within a term. And that is why the extension of the term could very well work for them in that regard. Of course, it takes away, for instance, on the one hand, it helps the council in providing the services. On the other hand, it could take away that democratic right of the citizenry, because whereas, for instance, with a 3-year term, if, for instance, the community, the citizenry, the burgesses are of the opinion that some politicians are not doing what they are required to do, the shorter term will mean that we have a faster time to remove them, have that quicker turnover, and then move forward. But of course, the longer term would mean that we may be stuck with some politicians who could be seen as deadweights within the system. And that is the context in which we have to look at the pros and cons of both the longer term and the shorter term.
But let me add a pro and a con to what you've just itemized, please, Dr. Ragoonath, in the sense that even before we start to talk about proposed changes to the legislation, I can see some individuals, and this is even before so we're not looking at what property tax may do for upkeep of these areas. But you spoke about council, and you actually had me thinking back to when it was county council instead of regional corporations. But I can also imagine that having a longer period, in addition to getting more time to implement it, carry things through, would also mean that there is not that, I don't want to say that willingness to please in certain ways, but the way that you don't have to start your election machinery again and say that, okay, well, I need to make sure that these people, they see that I'm working for them, as opposed to saying, okay, well, but a pro that could also be that less money is spent, or you have a little more time to allocate money to other things because it isn't going into elections. How do those factor into what some of those points that you would have made a little earlier? Thanks.
Now, again, if I may use that as an example, I would say that there's the con towards that too. Yes, you may be spending less money on elections, but then when do we get things done in a hurry? Is it not in the run up to an election? So, for instance, we know now, in fact, and I have been saying it, that one of the reasons in this particular case that the government probably would have been happy to extend the term of the current local government bodies is simply to ensure that they have an additional year now to go and do all the things that they should have been doing in the last 3 years, which they didn't do, i.e., fix the roads. I mean, throughout the country, there's not any part of this country that we can go to where we could talk about having good roads. Roads are in a deplorable state. And and I'm not only here talking about the secondary roads, I'm talking about the primary roads, but notwithstanding that, local government is responsible for the secondary roads. And now is the time when we probably within the next year, we're going to see the rollout of mass paving. Whether we're going to get quality paving is another question. But we're going to see mass paving, and that in itself might be a good thing. But if we had a shorter term, that probably should have happened last year.
And that actually ties back to that possibility that I was saying, possibly there may be a little less excitement or impetus to please, looking at the fact that you have a longer term. But we continue the conversation when we come back. There are a few things I want to talk about, including having general population knowing what they should be getting from their politicians, persons representing them, and agitating to get that. But we return to this conversation with political scientist Dr. Bishnu Ragoonath, and political analyst rather, and we ask you to stay with us because we're going to return with more. Welcome back. We're speaking with Dr. Bishnu Ragoonath. And Dr. Ragoonath, in terms of having an enlightened population, what is the importance of things like civics, individuals knowing, okay, well, this is what this politician or this representative is supposed to give to me, is supposed to be doing, and being able to say, well, please do what you're supposed to, because both of us know what you're supposed to be doing. What kind of implications do we have for that?
Okay, so just before I answer that question, let me just go back to a point you made just before you went to the break. It's really political scientists. You were correct when you said political scientists,
okay,
not political analysts. All right, so what can the citizenry expect? Well, politicians come every so often and tell us, this is my manifesto, this is what I'm promising to do. The question is, are they actually going to do it? And just before every election, we do a tally and we say, well, all of these things you would have promised, half of which you did, or quarter of which you did, and 3/4 of which is left undone. But the question here is simply one which says, what do we really expect of the citizenry, and what should the citizenry expect of the politician? Well, in the first instance, let us talk about the citizenry. And the citizenry knows what they need. They know what is required on the ground. They know what services are required, they know everything that they about their own environment. They are the ones now who are to ensure that their representatives, their elected representatives, properly represent their needs. And I say this simply because in the past we have had the problems, we have had the challenges where, for instance, after a person gets elected, they don't go back to their community, they don't go back to the citizenry, and they simply follow what will then determine to be party directives. So the party tells you you have to do this, the party tells you you have to do that, and notwithstanding that it runs counter to what the citizenry thought that you were going to do and what you would have promised the citizenry prior to getting elected, you are now following party directives.
But
So that's
that
one
takes
of
me
the
back to that takes me back to the same question, please, Dr. Ragoonath, and I'll use your example of roads. So, looking at roads and saying, okay, well, this road needs to be fixed. People in the area or people using that road saying, okay, well, this road is under the purview of this ministry, so we need to speak to them in order to say, well, advocate for ourselves, fix this road, as opposed to a secondary road or a road that is under the responsibility of a regional corporation. And sometimes you even have one person sending you this way and then another person sending you this way, and you almost keep going in a circle as opposed to knowing this is who I'm supposed to be asking for that. If we were to do that,
and
if
that
we were
is
to do that, how does that impact?
and that is the challenge, because to a large extent of the times, we are left in the dark. We, the citizenry, are left in the dark as to exactly what or who under whose portfolio, under whose purview certain things are supposed to be done. And we get the runaround. So go to this one, go to that one. Now we know for a fact that all primary roads fall under the Ministry of Works, all secondary roads are supposed to fall, and secondary and agricultural roads are supposed to fall under the local government authority. But of course, what is going to happen now? And this is where the challenge is, because so a road is in a deplorable state. You go to your councillor, you go to your local authority or regional corporation and say, why can't this road be fixed? And their first response, we don't have the resources. We have not been allocated resources by the Ministry of Finance. And so we get the excuse we don't have the money. So blame the Ministry of Finance. You go to the local government ministry or you go to the Ministry of Finance and says, and as far as they're concerned, that's not our responsibility. That's local government responsibility. That's one of the fears, and I have to say this, the fears that I have with the proposed local government reform. With the local government reform that has been passed and is supposed to be implemented within the next year. Because, and I will use this specific example. A week ago or so, when Minister Alwari reported that we were going to do the implementation and the rollout of the local government reform, he boasted and said, well, schools will now fall under the remit of local government authorities, all government and government assisted schools, the maintenance of which will now fall under the remit of the local government corporations. But guess what? If the local government corporations are finding it difficult already to do what they are required to do, are we going to expect them to do proper maintenance on all the schools? If we had to check the amount of schools in Trinidad and Tobago, we have over 600 schools in Trinidad alone, primary and secondary. And are we now going to wait until the local government authorities come to do maintenance on those schools? Then those schools could end up very much so dilapidated. And that's the challenge we have. So it is in that context, I will have a serious concern when I'm being told schools will now fall under the remit of the local authorities, when I know that they are finding it difficult already to do what they are required to. So I use that as an example merely to illustrate that we have to be wary of what a local government could do. Who is responsible? The whole question too. So we've been told that when property tax comes on stream, the local government authorities will get the funding from the property taxes that are paid on residential properties. Well, that's all well and good. But the whole notion that when property taxes are collected directly by the local government authority and they could then spend that money, bear in mind that they will do that. But at the same point in time, the Ministry of Finance, who is supposed to be allocating resources to the various regional corporations, may very well say to them, well, look, we were going to allocate you $100 million, but you are collecting $25 million in property taxes, so we are now only going to allocate you $75 million. Will that ensure that they have the resources to do the expanded duties that we have been talked about? No, they don't. And that's where we'll have to make sure that in the rollout of this reform program, that this rollout does not alienate and marginalize people, but rather works towards the benefit and the development of people.
And in terms of that development, Dr. Ragoonath, we have about 2 minutes more. Are there any other points that you're looking at? You just spoke about schools. Are there any other points with the legislation in the reform proposed or passed that you're looking at with regard to local government reform that are either good or giving you pause?
Well, I must say that there are certain things in the legislation that I am very much so happy with, that the proposed legislation. So, for instance, the ability for local government authorities to become somewhat financially self-sufficient. That's a plus. The whole issue of having executive councils in the local government authorities, that too is a plus. But of course, again, we could be sold things differently. So, for instance, the government tells us, well, at least the reform agenda tells us, for instance, that there are, I think, 13 items or Schedule 13 in the legislation that will now list the areas that the local government authority will have responsibility for. Now, if we are to read that, and for those of us who may not read it very carefully, we may seem to think that that operates in the same way as the THA does in Tobago. No, it doesn't. Because the THA has the power to make policy and implement policies for everything in Schedule 5 of the THA Act, Act 40 of 1996. Whereas this Schedule 13 in this local government amendment does not say you have the right to make policy. All it says is you have the power to implement policy, most of which is dictated by central government. So again, for people who want to do comparisons between the THA Act and what we are going to be getting, be very careful. You could be buying something that you are not really getting.
Manse Katin Bagui, thank you so much, Dr. Ragoonath, and it's always a pleasure having you kind of break down some of these things so we say, okay, well, all right, I should look at this a little more, I should look at this a little more. Really a pleasure. Thank you so much, Dr. Bishnu Ragoonath, political scientist. And on behalf of the entire TTT News team, I'm Dike Rostant. This has been In Depth. Thank you so much for joining us.